I'm 63 years old, living alone in the same cabin in the Brooks Range of Alaska that I inherited from my father. And for the last 19 years, I've been carrying a secret that's kept me awake more nights than I can count. From 2004 to 2018, through some of the harshest winters this mountain has ever seen, I sheltered a creature that shouldn't exist, a Bigfoot. I never gave him a name, he wouldn't have understood it, and somehow it felt wrong to name something so old, so intelligent, but we understood each other. We built something I can only describe as trust, maybe even friendship. And then, in March of 2018, on the last night I ever saw him, he showed me something that made me understand why he'd been hiding all those years. Why they all have been hiding. What he revealed wasn't just terrifying, it was a warning. And I don't know if I should have kept it to myself, or if staying silent makes me complicit in what might be coming. This is the story of those 14 winters, and the truth I've been too afraid to tell. Until now. November 2004. The first major blizzard of the season hit on November 8th, and I was not prepared for what it would bring to my doorstep. I was 44 years old, recently divorced, living alone in my father's old hunting cabin about 40 miles northwest of Wiseman, Alaska. My dad had died the previous spring, leaving me the property and enough money that I could quit my job as a school administrator in Fairbanks and just disappear for a while. I'd been planning to use the winter to figure out my next move, to process the divorce and the grief in solitude. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a generator for electricity. But it was mine, and it was far enough from everything that I didn't have to pretend I was okay. That morning, when I heard something collapse against my woodpile, I thought it was just a branch coming down in the wind. I had no idea I was about to make a choice that would define the next 14 years of my life. The wind was howling so loud, I almost didn't investigate. I was standing at the stove making coffee, still in my thermal underwear and wool socks, watching the snow come down sideways outside the window. The temperature had dropped to 15 below overnight, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. When I heard the crash, heavy, not like a branch at all now that I think about it, my first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever had fallen could wait until the storm passed, but something made me look. Maybe it was the fact that I'd been alone for 6 months, and any disruption to the monotony felt significant. Maybe it was just concern about my woodpile getting buried. I don't know. I pulled on my parka boots and gloves, grabbed the flashlight from beside the door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical force, that kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your lungs ache. I had to lean into the wind just to make it around the side of the cabin to where I kept the wood stacked against the shed. And that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. There was too much snow, too much wind, and the shape didn't make sense. I thought maybe it was a moose that had collapsed. They sometimes died in bad storms, just gave out from exhaustion or cold. But as I got closer, sweeping the flashlight beam across the snow, I realized it wasn't a moose. It was something else entirely. Something massive and dark and covered in fur, but not like any animal I'd ever seen in 44 years of living in Alaska. It was lying on its side, partially covered in snow already, and I could see blood, dark against the white, spreading out from underneath it. The fur was brown, almost black in places, matted and frozen. And the shape, God, the shape was wrong, too human. Arms that were too long, hands with fingers, a face that I couldn't see clearly, but that made something primal in my brain scream that this wasn't possible, this couldn't be real. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, snow driving into my face, the wind making it hard to think. Every rational part of me said to go back inside, to pretend I hadn't seen this, to let nature take its course. But I couldn't stop staring at the way its chest was moving. Barely, just small, shallow movements that meant it was still alive, still fighting. And I thought about my father, how he died alone in a hospital room in Anchorage while I was stuck in a meeting I couldn't get out of. How I'd arrived 2 hours too late to say goodbye. How that guilt had been eating at me for months. I made a decision in that moment that I've questioned 1,000 times since. I couldn't save my father. I couldn't save my marriage, but maybe, I could save this impossible thing that had collapsed in my snow. Even if I didn't know what it was, even if every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to walk away. I went back inside for a tarp and rope, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the knots. And as I started the long, impossible process of dragging this creature toward my cabin, I remember thinking, this is insane. This is absolutely insane. You're going to regret this. I had no idea how right I was, and I had no idea that regret would be the least of what I'd feel. The thing lying in the snow wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I'd ever seen in 44 years of living in Alaska. It was massive, maybe 7 feet tall, even curled on its side, covered in dark brown fur that was matted with ice and blood. And it was dying. I stood there in my boots and parka, snow driving into my face, staring at this impossible creature and thinking about all the rational things I should do. Go back inside. Call someone. Pretend I never saw it. But I couldn't stop looking at its face, so human in some ways, so alien in others, and the way its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. I'd found injured animals before, living out here. You learn to either help them or leave them to nature. But this wasn't just an animal. I could see that even then, even in shock. This was something that understood it was dying, something that had crawled to my cabin like it knew shelter was there. And I had to decide, was I the kind of person who could walk away from that? I knelt down in the snow, close enough now to see details that made my throat tight. The face, God, the face. It had a pronounced brow, a flat nose, lips that were almost human-shaped. But it was the eyes that stopped me cold. They were closed, crusted with ice and blood, but the structure of them, the way they sat in the face, they weren't animal eyes. They were too forward-facing, too expressive even in unconsciousness. And the hands. I found myself staring at the hands, partially buried in snow. 5 fingers, opposable thumbs, nails, not claws, palms that showed lines and creases like my own. The wounds were severe. Deep gashes across the shoulder that looked like claw marks, bear maybe, or wolf. The left leg was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made me wince. But there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. On the visible parts of the chest and arms beneath the matted fur, I could see scars. Old scars, silvered and healed, running in straight lines that weren't from any animal attack. Those were deliberate. Those were made by something with intent. I reached out, I don't know why, maybe just to confirm this was real, and touched the fur on its arm. It was coarse, thick, designed for brutal cold. And warm. Still warm, which meant there was still time, still a chance. The creature didn't respond to my touch, didn't even flinch. Unconscious or too weak to react, I couldn't tell. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice lost in the wind. Not expecting an answer, just needing to say something, anything, to make this moment feel less impossible. "Where did you come from?" I thought about calling someone. I had a satellite phone for emergencies. I could call the Fish and Wildlife Office in Fairbanks, report finding an unknown animal. They'd send someone eventually once the storm cleared. They'd study it, photograph it, probably take it away, and I'd have done the responsible thing, the rational thing. But even as I considered it, I knew I wouldn't make that call. Because this thing, this being, had come to my cabin specifically, had dragged itself through a blizzard to this exact spot, and something about that felt intentional, like it had chosen me, or maybe like we'd chosen each other. My ex-husband Tom used to say I had a savior complex, that I couldn't see something hurting without trying to fix it, even when fixing it wasn't my responsibility. He'd meant it as a criticism, but standing there in the snow, looking at this impossible creature bleeding out by my woodpile, I wondered if maybe he'd been right. Maybe I did need to feel needed. Maybe that's why the divorce had hit so hard, because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't necessary to anyone. But this wasn't about me. Or maybe it was, but it was about something bigger too. This was about what kind of person I wanted to be when no one was watching, when there were no consequences, except the ones I'd have to live with. Could I really go back inside, warm up by the stove, and let this being die 20 feet from my door? Could I live with that choice? I grabbed the tarp I'd dropped and spread it next to the creature. My hands were already numb from the cold, and I knew I didn't have much time before frostbite became a real concern. But I had even less time to save whatever this was, if saving it was even possible. "Okay," I said, more to myself than to the unconscious form. "Okay, I'm going to try to help you. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to try." As I began the brutal work of rolling that massive body onto the tarp, my back already screaming in protest, I thought, this is the moment. This is the choice that splits your life into before and after, and you're making it alone, in a blizzard, for something that shouldn't even exist. I had no idea how right I was, and I had no idea that alone was about to become a lot more complicated. I don't know how I got him inside. Even half dead, he had to weigh close to 400 pounds. I ended up dragging him on a tarp, inch by inch, across the snow and through my door, destroying my back in the process. By the time I got in position near the wood stove, I was shaking so badly I could barely add logs to the fire. The creature, I didn't know what else to call him, stayed unconscious through all of it, which was probably a mercy for both of us. His injuries were severe, deep gashes across his shoulder and side, like he'd been attacked by something with claws or teeth, and his left leg was clearly broken, the foot twisted at an unnatural angle. I cleaned the wounds with water and antiseptic, working by the light of my camping lantern, my hands steady despite my racing heart. I'd done wilderness first aid training years ago, but this was different. His anatomy was similar to human, but not identical. The muscles were denser, the bone structure heavier. And as I worked, I kept thinking, what am I doing? What happens when he wakes up? The cabin smelled like wet fur and blood and the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic. I'd never been more aware of how small my space was, maybe 300 square feet total, with this massive being now taking up most of my floor. The wood stove threw shadows that made him look even larger, even more impossible. I kept glancing at the door, making sure it was bolted, though I wasn't sure if I was keeping danger out or keeping it in. The gashes were deep enough that I could see muscle beneath the fur. I packed them with gauze soaked in betadine, my hands moving with a confidence I didn't feel. The broken leg was worse. I had no way to set it properly, no cast, no real medical supplies beyond a basic first aid kit. I did what I could, splinting it with kindling and strips of cloth torn from an old sheet, trying to remember everything I'd learned in that weekend wilderness medicine course 15 years ago. The whole time I talked to him in a low voice, not expecting him to hear but needing the sound of my own words to keep the panic at bay. "Okay, we're going to stabilize this leg now," I said, positioning the splint. "This is probably going to hurt when you wake up, but it's better than the alternative." My voice sounded strange in the small space, too loud, too nervous. "I'm not a doctor. I don't know what I'm doing. But I'm trying, okay? I'm trying." When I finally finished, wounds cleaned, leg splinted, his massive form covered with every spare blanket I owned, I sat back against the wall and just stared at him. The reality of what I'd done was starting to sink in, and with it came a wave of fear so intense it made my hands shake. I'd brought something into my home that I didn't understand, couldn't control, and had no plan for. If he woke up aggressive, if he attacked me, I was done. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. My satellite phone was in the other room, but what would I even say? Help? I rescued a Bigfoot and now I'm afraid it might kill me. But worse than the fear was the doubt. What if I'd made the wrong choice? What if letting him die would have been kinder than prolonging his suffering in a place where he didn't belong? What if I'd saved him only to trap him, to make him dependent on me for survival? I thought about my father's last days in that hospital, tubes and machines keeping him alive when he'd told me months before that he never wanted to die that way. Had I just done the same thing to this creature? Imposed my will, my need to save something, without considering what he might have wanted? The storm howled outside, and inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the creature's labored breathing. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, suddenly exhausted beyond anything I'd ever felt. My back was screaming from dragging him inside. My hands were raw from the cold and the work, and my mind was racing with questions I had no way to answer. What was he? Where had he come from? How had he been injured? And most importantly, What was I supposed to do now? I must have fallen asleep sitting there against the wall, because when I opened my eyes, the fire had burned down to embers, and pale dawn light was filtering through the window. The storm had passed, and in that early morning quiet, I heard it, a sound that made my breath catch. He was still breathing, steadier now, deeper. He'd made it through the night. I added logs to the fire and watched the flames catch, feeling something shift in my chest. I'd committed to this now, whether I'd meant to or not. I'd pulled him out of that snow, brought him into my home, spent hours trying to save his life. And now that he'd survived the night, I was responsible for what came next. I just had no idea what that looked like, or if either of us would survive long enough to find out. He woke up on the third day, and I genuinely thought he might kill me. His eyes opened, deep amber, unnervingly human, and locked onto mine with an intensity that made every survival instinct I had scream at me to run. But I forced myself to stay still, to keep my voice low and calm, to show him I wasn't a threat. "It's okay," I said, like I was talking to a frightened dog. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." For maybe 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then he tried to stand, couldn't put weight on the broken leg, and collapsed back down with a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a whimper. That's when I understood. He was as scared of me as I was of him. Over the next week, we developed a careful routine. I'd leave food near him, canned stew, dried fish, whatever I had, and back away. He'd eat when I wasn't looking. I'd approach slowly to check his wounds, telegraphing every movement, and he'd let me, though his whole body stayed tense and ready to react. We were negotiating the terms of his captivity and my guardianship, neither of us sure what we were agreeing to. The first time I changed his bandages while he was conscious, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the gauze. He watched every movement, his amber eyes tracking my hands as I peeled away the blood-soaked cloth from his shoulder wound. When I dabbed antiseptic on the raw flesh, he made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a grunt of pain, and his whole body went rigid. I froze, waiting to see if he'd lash out, but he just breathed through it, his massive chest rising and falling, and let me finish. "Good," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "That's good. You're doing great." The absurdity of the situation hit me in waves. I was a school administrator from Fairbanks, 44 years old, recently divorced, living alone in the wilderness. I had no training for this, no expertise, no idea what I was doing. And yet, here I was, tending wounds on a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, speaking to it like it could understand me, hoping that my good intentions would somehow be enough to keep us both alive. By day 5, something shifted. I was heating up soup on the wood stove when I felt it, that prickly sensation of being watched. I turned slowly and found him looking at me, not with fear or suspicion, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Assessment. He was trying to figure me out the same way I was trying to figure him out. "Hungry?" I asked, holding up the pot. He didn't respond. Of course he didn't, but his eyes followed the movement. I ladled soup into a bowl, set it on the floor about 6 feet from where he lay, and backed away to my usual spot against the far wall. For the first time, he didn't wait for me to look away. He reached for the bowl and ate while I watched, his movements deliberate and careful, almost polite, like he was showing me he understood the rules of this space we were sharing. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag in the corner of the cabin, staring at the ceiling and listening to him breathe. The sound had become oddly comforting, proof that my choice to save him hadn't been for nothing, that he was healing, that we were both surviving this impossible situation. But I couldn't shake the guilt that came with it. Was I keeping him prisoner? He couldn't leave, not with that leg. And even when it healed, where would he go? Back into the wilderness to die alone? Or would he stay because he had nowhere else to go, trapped by circumstance in a cabin with a woman who'd made herself responsible for his survival? I thought about my marriage, how Tom had accused me of being controlling, of needing to manage everything, of never letting him just exist without my constant intervention. "You suffocate people," he'd said during our last fight. "You think you're helping, but really you just can't stand not being needed." Was that what I was doing now? taking something wild and broken and forcing it to depend on me because I couldn't face my own loneliness. Because having a purpose, even an impossible one, felt better than sitting alone in this cabin with nothing but my grief and my failures. On the seventh day, something happened that I'll never forget. I was checking his leg wound, unwrapping the splint to see if the swelling had gone down, when he reached out, slowly, carefully, and touched my hand. Just for a second, just the lightest pressure of his massive fingers against my skin. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was deliberate, intentional, a gesture that said, "I see you. I understand what you're doing for me." I looked up and met those amber eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see fear in them. I saw something that looked almost like trust. "We're going to be okay," I said softly, and I wasn't sure which of us I was trying to convince. "I don't know how this works or what happens next, but we're going to figure it out." He didn't respond, but he didn't pull his hand away either. And in that moment, in that small cabin in the Alaska wilderness, two impossible beings made an unspoken agreement. We would try. We would both try to make this work, whatever this was. I just hoped we could live with whatever that choice would cost us. By December, he could put weight on his leg again, and I knew he'd be leaving soon. Part of me was relieved. My life could go back to normal. This impossible situation would end. But another part of me felt something I hadn't expected. Reluctance. I'd gotten used to having him there, this silent presence that somehow made the cabin feel less empty. Then, the second blizzard hit, worse than the first, with temperatures dropping to 40 below and wind that made the cabin walls shake. He'd been testing, his weight on the leg, pacing near the door like he was planning his departure. But that night, when the storm howled outside and the cold seemed to seep through every crack, he settled back down near the wood stove and looked at me with what I swear was resignation. He was stuck here. We both were. And we were going to have to find a way to survive the winter together. I pulled my sleeping bag closer to the stove, not quite near him, but not across the room either. "Looks like we're roommates for a while," I said. He made a soft sound, not aggressive, almost conversational. And that's when I realized this wasn't temporary anymore. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days where opening the door was impossible, where the wind screamed so loud we couldn't hear anything else, where the cold was so intense that frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning constantly. I'd lived through bad winters before, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that killed people, that made you understand how small and fragile human life really was out here. And I wasn't alone in it. That changed everything. We fell into a rhythm born of necessity. I'd wake up at dawn to feed the wood stove, and he'd be awake too, watching me move around the small space. I'd make coffee. He seemed fascinated by the process, the way the water heated, the smell that filled the cabin. And he'd eat whatever dried meat or canned food I set out for him. We took turns near the stove, an unspoken agreement about sharing warmth. And in the evening, when the darkness came early and complete, we'd sit together in the firelight, not talking. He couldn't, and I'd run out of things to say. Just existing in each other's presence. On the second night of the storm, I caught him watching me read. I'd been going through one of my father's old books, a collection of Jack London stories, and when I looked up, his eyes were fixed on the pages with an intensity that surprised me. "Do you understand what this is?" I asked, holding up the book. He tilted his head, a gesture I'd come to recognize as curiosity or consideration. On impulse, I started reading aloud. "To build a fire." My voice felt strange in the small space, competing with the storm outside, but I kept going. And he listened. Not just passively, he was engaged, leaning forward slightly, his amber eyes never leaving my face. When I finished the story, he made a sound, low and almost mournful, and I realized he'd understood the story of a man alone in the brutal cold, making mistakes, dying because of his arrogance and isolation. He'd recognized something in it. Maybe he'd been that man once, alone and struggling to survive. Maybe he still was, and I was just a temporary shelter from the storm. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. I should have picked a happier story. But he reached out, that gesture he'd started making, touching my hand briefly, and I understood it wasn't about the ending. It was about the connection, about sharing something, about not being alone with the fear and the cold. That night, I woke up to find he'd moved closer while I slept. Not touching, not invasive, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. Close enough that his breathing had become part of the cabin's rhythm, the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, the steady rise and fall of his chest. And I realized, with a sharp clarity, that I didn't want him to leave. Not because I was afraid to be alone. I'd chosen solitude when I came here. But because in 6 weeks, this creature had become... I didn't have a word for it. Not a pet. He was too intelligent, too self-aware. Not a patient. He wasn't sick anymore. Not a friend exactly, because friendship implied equality and understanding, and we had neither. But something. Someone who mattered. Someone whose presence had filled a space I hadn't known was empty. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, I opened the door to a world transformed by snow. Drifts 6 feet high, everything buried and silent and impossibly beautiful. He came to stand beside me in the doorway, and together we looked out at the endless white. I thought he'd go then. The way was clear, the weather calm enough. He could leave if he wanted to, but he didn't. He just stood there, breathing in the cold air, and then turned and went back inside. Back to the fire, back to the space he'd claimed near the wood stove, and I understood what he was telling me. Not yet. He wasn't ready to leave yet. Maybe the leg wasn't strong enough. Maybe he was still healing, or maybe... And this is the thought that kept me awake that night. Maybe he was as reluctant to go as I was to let him. I'd come to this cabin to be alone, to escape from a marriage that had failed, and a life that had disappointed me. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, alone had stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like empty. And this impossible being had filled that emptiness with something I couldn't name but couldn't imagine losing. That was the moment I stopped planning for his departure and started planning for his stay. Not forever, I wasn't that naive, but for as long as he needed, for as long as we both needed. I just hoped I wasn't making another mistake. I just hoped I wasn't trapping him the way my marriage had trapped me, with good intentions and no exit. January 2005. 3 months since I'd found him, and we'd developed a language that had nothing to do with words. He'd tilt his head a certain way when he was curious. I'd hold out my hands, palms up, to show I wasn't hiding anything. He'd huff, short and sharp, when he wanted me to back off, and I'd learned to respect that boundary immediately. I'd started leaving books and magazines near him, not sure if he could understand pictures, but curious to see what he'd do. One morning, I found him holding a National Geographic open to a photo spread of mountains, gorillas in Rwanda. He was touching the images gently, almost reverently, and when he noticed me watching, he pointed to the gorillas, then to himself. Family, I thought, or maybe just recognition, something else that didn't fit into the human world. That's when I started wondering about his life before the storm, before the injuries, before he ended up at my cabin. Where had he come from? Was he alone by choice or by necessity? And if I helped him survive the winter, where would he go when spring came? I sat down slowly across from him, careful not to crowd his space. "You had family," I said softly. It wasn't a question. He looked at me for a long moment, then back at the magazine. His massive finger, so careful, so precise, traced the outline of a smaller gorilla, a juvenile sitting close to an adult. Then he touched his chest right over his heart and made a sound I'd never heard before. Low, broken, full of something that transcended species. Grief. "Where are they?" I asked, though I knew he couldn't answer in words. "Are they still out there somewhere?" He set down the magazine and moved to the window. His leg was healed enough now that he barely limped and stared out at the endless white landscape. He raised one hand and gestured north, a sweeping motion that encompassed distances I couldn't fathom. North. Somewhere north. And from the way his shoulders slumped, from the way he touched his chest again, I understood. He couldn't get to them. Or they couldn't get to him. Or maybe they were gone entirely, and that grief I'd heard was for something already lost. I felt my throat tighten. 3 months I'd spent saving this being, nursing him back to health, building trust and communication. And only now was I beginning to understand the cost of his survival. He wasn't just injured when I found him. He was separated, cut off from whatever life, whatever family, whatever world he'd belonged to before. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words felt inadequate, meaningless against the weight of what he was trying to tell me. But he turned from the window and looked at me, and in his amber eyes I saw something that broke my heart. Acceptance. He'd already grieved. This wasn't fresh pain. This was old pain, carried and endured. Over the next few weeks, our communication deepened in ways that still amaze me. He learned to use my pencils, holding them awkwardly in his massive fingers at first, then with increasing dexterity. He'd draw simple pictures to show me what he needed or wanted. A circle with rays meant daytime, safe to be near the window. A circle without rays meant nighttime, when he'd sometimes slip outside to stand in the darkness. He drew mountains, forests, rivers, places he'd been, maybe, or places he remembered. And I started teaching him things without really planning to. Numbers first. I'd count pieces of firewood as I brought them in, point at objects around the cabin and say their names. He'd watch intently, his head tilted, in that curious way, and then he'd repeat the gestures back to me. Touch the wood stove, touch his hand, touch me. Connecting things, building a vocabulary of understanding that had nothing to do with speech. One evening in late January, I was working on a puzzle, a 1,000-piece landscape my father had left behind. I'd spread it across the small table, sorting edge pieces, and I didn't notice him approach until he was standing beside me. Before I could move, before I could ask what he wanted, he reached down and picked up a piece. For a moment, I thought he was just curious, examining the cardboard and colors. But then he placed it, exactly where it belonged. The right spot, first try, no hesitation. I stared at the completed section, then up at him. "How did you?" But he was already reaching for another piece, studying it, placing it with the same precise confidence. He could see the pattern, could understand how the fragments fit together to create the whole. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was problem-solving, spatial reasoning, intelligence operating on a level I'd barely begun to comprehend. We worked on the puzzle together for the next 2 hours, in complete silence, except for the snap of pieces fitting together. And as I watched his massive hands, hands that could probably crush my skull without effort, carefully, gently, thoughtfully placing each piece, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't an animal I was sheltering. This wasn't even just an intelligent creature. This was a person, a being with thoughts and memories and feelings and capabilities that matched or exceeded my own. And I'd been keeping him locked in a cabin all winter. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. What had I done? Yes, I'd saved his life. Yes, he'd stayed by choice once he could walk. But had he really chosen, or had I just made myself necessary to his survival? Had I given him actual options, or had I created a situation where staying with me was his only viable path forward? That night, lying in my sleeping bag while he slept near the stove, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I thought I was doing the right thing, offering shelter, protection, care. But maybe I was just repeating the same pattern that had destroyed my marriage. Taking someone vulnerable and making them dependent on me, convincing myself it was love when really it was control. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. Because letting him go meant sending him out into a world where he'd been injured, separated from his family, left to die alone in a blizzard. And keeping him meant continuing this strange captivity, this impossible relationship where neither of us could fully understand what we meant to each other. All I knew was that he deserved better than what I could give him, and I had no idea how to give it to him anyway. The supply plane came in mid-February, earlier than I'd expected. I heard the engine before I saw it, that distinctive drone of a bush plane that meant Walt Henderson was making his rounds to the remote cabins. I had maybe 3 minutes to hide a 7-foot Bigfoot in a 2-room cabin. "Closet," I said urgently, pointing. He looked at me, then at the small storage closet off the main room, and I saw him understand immediately. He folded himself into that tiny space with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for something his size, and I threw my winter coats over him and shut the door just as Walt's knock came. "Martha, you in there?" Walt was 68, a retired pilot who made supply runs because he couldn't stand being grounded. Good man, talker, nosy in the way that people who live alone tend to be. I opened the door, trying to look casual while my heart hammered. "Walt, good to see you." We talked for maybe 15 minutes, too long, way too long, while he unloaded my supplies and updated me on town gossip. The whole time, I was hyper-aware of the closet door, of any sound that might come from inside. When he finally left, I waited until the plane's engine faded before opening the closet. The creature emerged slowly, looking at me with an expression I'd learned to read: understanding. He knew I'd just chosen him over normalcy, over honesty, over the easy path. Those 15 minutes with Walt were the longest of my life. He moved around the cabin with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd been making these runs for years, stacking supplies on my counter, commenting on how I'd rearranged things since his last visit. "You been doing okay out here?" he asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in his voice. "Must get lonely." "I'm fine," I said, positioning myself between him and the closet door. "I like the quiet." "That's what you say now," Walt laughed, setting down a box of canned goods. "But I've seen what happens to folks who spend too much time alone. Start talking to themselves, start seeing things." He paused, sniffed the air. "You got a dog now? Smells different in here." My stomach dropped. No dog, just I've been curing some deer hide for a project." The lie came surprisingly easily, and that scared me more than almost getting caught. Walt nodded, accepting the explanation, and continued his monologue about weather patterns and town news. Someone's daughter was getting married. The general store had new owners. Normal, mundane life happening 40 miles away while I stood there, my secret folded into a closet 4 feet behind Walt's back, praying he wouldn't need to hang up his coat. When he finally climbed back into his plane and took off, I stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared into the gray sky. Only then did I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to brace them against the doorframe. I went to the closet and opened the door slowly. He was still there, crammed into that impossible space, his amber eyes watching me in the dimness. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he unfolded himself, emerging from the closet with the quiet dignity of someone who'd just endured something humiliating for the sake of survival. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Degrading? Necessary? Proof that this situation was unsustainable?" But he just looked at me, and then he did something that made my throat tight. He touched his chest, the gesture that meant understanding, acknowledgement, and then he touched mine. Gently, deliberately. "We're in this together." I sat down hard on my sleeping bag, the adrenaline draining away and leaving me hollow. "I lied to him," I said, not sure why I needed to say it out loud. "Walt's a good man. He's helped me out here, checked on me, made sure I had what I needed, and I just looked him in the eye and lied." The creature moved to sit across from me, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller in the aftermath of the closet. He'd made himself small for me, had hidden himself, trusted that I'd protect him, endured that cramped space because the alternative was exposure, capture, or worse. "This is going to keep happening," I continued, more to myself than to him. "People are going to visit. Walt will come back. Eventually someone will notice something off, or I'll make a mistake, or..." I stopped, overwhelmed by the impossibility of maintaining this secret long term. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to keep you safe and keep lying to people and act like everything's normal." He reached for the pencil and paper we kept nearby now and drew something simple. 2 figures, side by side. Then he drew a circle around them. Together. Protected. Then he drew another figure outside the circle, pointing inward. Danger. "I know," I whispered. "I know other people are the danger, but Walt isn't. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He's just trying to help, and I had to lie to him because telling the truth would destroy everything." That's when it really hit me, the full weight of what I'd committed to. This wasn't just about keeping a secret through the winter. This was about building a life around deception, about choosing one being's safety over every honest relationship I might have with another human. Every conversation would be filtered, every visitor a threat, every moment of connection shadowed by the knowledge that I was living a lie. And the worst part, I'd do it again. Without hesitation, I'd stuff him back in that closet, tell Walt the same lies, protect this impossible secret because the alternative, turning him over to people who'd study him, cage him, treat him like a specimen instead of a person, was unthinkable. I looked at him sitting there, patient and trusting, and I understood what I'd become. Not a savior, not a guardian, just someone who'd chosen one life over the comfort of truth, and who'd have to live with that choice for as long as this lasted. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay, we'll figure it out. But next time Walt comes, we're going to have a better plan than shoving you in a closet, deal?" He made that soft sound that I'd learned meant agreement, maybe even approval. And despite everything, despite the fear and the lies and the impossible situation, I felt something like relief. We'd survived the first test. There would be more, but we'd survived this one together. March brought the first signs of spring, and with it, a revelation that changed everything I thought I understood. I'd been working on taxes, spread out on my small table with receipts and a calculator, muttering complaints to myself. When I got up to make coffee, I came back to find him at the table, one massive finger moving across the numbers. Not randomly, deliberately, he was adding. I stood there frozen, watching him work through a column of figures, and when he reached the total, the correct total, he looked up at me, not seeking approval, just checking if I understood what he'd just shown me. "You can do math," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my pen, carefully, so carefully, and on the edge of a receipt, he drew a circle, a square, a triangle, basic shapes. Then he drew something more complex, what looked like a constellation or maybe a map, stars, mountains, I couldn't tell, but the message was clear. "I've been underestimating you. For months, I'd been treating him like an intelligent animal. But this was something else. This was a mind that understood abstract concepts, symbolic representation, mathematics. And suddenly, all my assumptions about what he was capable of, what he understood, what he thought about me, about this situation, crumbled. That night, I lay awake thinking, if he's this intelligent, does keeping him here make me his savior or his captor?" I sat down slowly across from him, my hands trembling. "How long have you been able to do this?" I asked, knowing he couldn't answer but needing to speak. "How long have you been watching me, understanding everything, while I've been treating you like—" I stopped, ashamed. "Like what? A pet? A patient? A responsibility that couldn't think for itself?" He drew more, filling the margins of my tax forms with symbols and patterns, mathematical sequences. Fibonacci, I recognized after a moment. Prime numbers. And then something that looked like musical notation, though I couldn't be sure. He was showing me the scope of what he understood, what he'd been capable of all along while I'd been reading him children's books and teaching him basic gestures like he was learning from scratch. "You already knew all of this," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You weren't learning from me. You were just learning to communicate with me. There's a difference, isn't there?" He tapped the table, one sharp rap, his gesture for yes, for agreement, for "You're finally getting it." Then he drew two figures, one large, one small. He pointed to the large figure, then to himself, pointed to the small figure, then to me. And I understood with a sick feeling what he was saying. In terms of knowledge, of understanding, of intellectual capacity, I wasn't his equal. I might not even be close. For 4 months, I'd been his caretaker, his guardian, the one in control. I'd fed him, sheltered him, made decisions about his life and safety. And all that time, he'd been humoring me, letting me believe I was helping, that I was necessary, that I understood what was happening between us. When really, the power dynamic I'd assumed was a fiction. He could leave anytime he wanted now. His leg was healed, spring was coming. He stayed by choice, not necessity. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why are you still here? You could leave. You could go north, find your family, your people. Why stay with someone who's been underestimating you this whole time?" He looked at me for a long moment, those amber eyes holding something I couldn't quite read. Then he drew again. A small figure, me, standing in snow. A larger figure, him, lying in the snow. An arrow between them, a circle around both. He tapped the circle, then touched his chest, then touched mine. You saved me when I was dying. That creates a bond. But I've been keeping you prisoner, I protested. Even if I didn't mean to, even if you could leave, you're trapped here because of me. Because the world outside isn't safe for you. And I'm the only shelter you have. He made a sound, not quite a huff, more like disagreement, and drew another picture. A figure in a cage with bars. Then a figure in a space with an open door. He pointed to the second one, then gestured around the cabin. This isn't a cage. This is a choice. But was it really? Or was I fooling myself, the way I'd been fooling myself about his intelligence? I thought about my marriage again, how Tom had accused me of being controlling, of making decisions for both of us because I thought I knew better. You make me feel like I can't do anything right, he'd said during one of our last fights. Like, I need your permission to live my own life. Was I doing the same thing to this being? Convincing myself I was protecting him when really I was just creating another dependent, someone who needed me, someone whose life revolved around my choices and my schedule and my understanding of what was best? Over the next few days, I tested him, unable to help myself. I gave him more complex puzzles. He solved them. I showed him mechanical problems with the generator. He fixed them, understanding the engine's logic faster than I'd learned it in 10 years. I played chess with him, a game I'd been decent at once, and he beat me in 12 moves. Not because he'd played before, I didn't think, but because he understood strategy, could see patterns and possibilities I couldn't comprehend. And with each demonstration of his capabilities, I felt smaller. Not threatened exactly, but humbled. Forced to reckon with the fact that I'd built a relationship based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was and what he needed from me. One evening, I finally asked the question that had been building since that day with the tax forms. What do you want? I said. From all of this? From me? If you could tell me anything, what would you say? He didn't hesitate. He drew a picture I'd seen before, the mountains to the north, the family he'd lost or left behind. Then, he drew something new. Himself, standing between me and the mountains, caught between two worlds, two allegiances, two impossibilities. And I understood. He wanted to go home, wanted to find his family, return to whatever life he'd had before injury and winter and my cabin. But he couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And so he stayed with me, not because he needed me, but because the alternative was wandering alone in a world that had already tried to kill him once. I wasn't his savior. I was just the lesser of two terrible options, and that hurt more than I wanted to admit. 2006 became 2007, and somehow we'd settled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. He'd helped me split wood, carefully, precisely, his strength making the work easy. I'd read aloud in the evenings, novels mostly, sometimes news articles, and he'd listen with a focus that made me believe he understood more than I gave him credit for. We'd developed routines, morning coffee, or in his case, hot water with wild berries I'd learned he liked, maintenance work on the cabin, evenings by the fire. I'd stopped thinking about when he'd leave and started thinking in terms of we instead of I. When the roof needed patching, I'd plan how we'd do it together. When food ran low, I'd calculate what we both needed. By 2008, I'd stopped checking the closet before Walt's visits. The creature had figured out the rhythm and would hide himself without prompting. We'd become partners in this impossible secret, this life we'd built out of that first desperate choice 4 years earlier. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was keeping him from something, his own kind, his home, whatever life he'd had before. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window at the mountains and I'd wonder, am I protecting him, or am I just lonely enough to convince myself this is right? The years changed us both in ways I didn't notice until they had already happened. I turned 47, then 48. Gray started appearing in my hair. My knees complained more on cold mornings. I'd catch myself moving slower, being more careful on icy ground, taking longer to recover from the physical work of maintaining the cabin. And he noticed, started doing more without being asked, bringing in extra firewood before I could, checking the generator, fixing things before they broke. One morning in the fall of 2007, I woke up to find he'd already started the coffee. Just figured out the machine, measured the grounds, heated the water. The smell pulled me from sleep, and when I emerged from my sleeping bag, there was a cup waiting for me on the table, still steaming. He was sitting by the window, his usual spot, and when he saw my expression, he made that soft sound that meant satisfaction. Proud of himself, pleased to have surprised me. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with more emotion than a cup of coffee deserved. But it wasn't about the coffee. It was about what it represented, that he'd been watching, learning, anticipating what I needed, that we'd moved past caretaker and dependent into something that felt uncomfortably like family. We developed our own small traditions. On clear nights, we'd go outside together, him moving with complete silence, me crunching through snow, and look at the stars. He'd point to constellations I didn't know, trace patterns in the sky that maybe meant something to him, to his people. Once, during the aurora borealis, I watched him stand transfixed for over an hour, his face tilted up, reflecting green and purple light. When he finally looked at me, there were tears in his eyes, just standing there on his face, freezing in the cold, and I understood. This was beauty he'd thought he might never see again. Walt's visits became easier, almost routine. I'd hear the plane, and by the time I opened the door to greet him, the creature would already be hidden. Sometimes the closet, sometimes the small storage space under the floor I'd modified. Walt never suspected. Or if he did, he was kind enough not to say anything. He'd comment sometimes that I seemed happier, more settled. "The wilderness suits you, Martha," he said once. "You've got color in your cheeks again. Purpose." Purpose. That word haunted me for weeks after. Because he was right, I did have purpose now. But was it the right purpose? Was giving my life meaning through keeping another being hidden actually noble or just selfish? By 2008, we could communicate complex ideas through our system of drawings and gestures. He showed me things about the forest I'd never known, which plants were edible, how to read weather in the way the wind moved, where animals would shelter. And I taught him things about the human world, showed him news on my laptop when I could get satellite internet, explained politics and wars and why humans did the terrible things we did. He'd watch the news with an expression I learned to recognize: deep sadness, but not surprise. Like he already knew what humans were capable of. One evening in late 2008, after I'd been reading about a war in some distant country, I looked up to find him drawing. When he showed me, my stomach dropped. It was humans with weapons, surrounding figures that looked like him, hunting them, capturing them, and in the margin, he'd written one word he'd learned to spell: why. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because we're afraid of what we don't understand. Because we want to control things. Because I stopped, not sure how to explain humanity's capacity for cruelty to a being who'd experienced it firsthand. He drew more, himself in a cage, others like him in other cages. A building, the same one he'd drawn years before, that I now understood must be where he'd been kept before he escaped, before his injuries, before that blizzard brought him to my doorstep. And suddenly, the scars I'd seen that first night took on new meaning. He hadn't been attacked by an animal. He'd escaped from captivity, from humans. "Is that why you can't go back?" I asked. "To your family? Because humans are looking for you?" He tapped the drawing. Yes. Then he drew something that made my blood run cold, figures like him being hunted systematically, region by region, a map of North America with X's marked across it. A genocide in progress, hidden from human awareness. I sat there in my cabin, warm and safe with this being I'd lived alongside for 4 years, and felt the full weight of what I'd been protecting him from. Not just the wilderness, not just the cold, but a deliberate, organized effort to eliminate his kind from existence. And by keeping him here, by hiding him, I'd saved one life while remaining complicit in my ignorance about how many others were being lost. "How many of you are left?" I asked. He held up both hands, fingers spread. 10. Then he paused, reconsidered, and folded down 3 fingers. 7. Maybe 7 of his kind left in the entire region. And I'd been worried about whether keeping him here was selfish. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness listening to him breathe, thinking about the impossible position we were both in. He couldn't leave without risking capture or death. I couldn't expose him without guaranteeing both. And so we stayed here, year after year, building a life that felt increasingly like a prison we'd both chosen because the alternative was worse. But at what point does chosen captivity become just another kind of cage? And at what point does protecting someone you care about become keeping them from the life they're supposed to have? I didn't have answers. Only the growing certainty that the longer this went on, the harder it would be for either of us to imagine any other way of living. Winter 2010. He got sick in January, a fever that left him shaking by the wood stove, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. I'd never been so terrified. Human medicine didn't work. I tried everything I had, and I couldn't exactly call a vet. For 3 days, I barely slept, monitoring his temperature with my hand on his forehead, forcing him to drink water, adding logs to the fire to keep him warm. I talked to him constantly, rambling about nothing just to fill the silence, to give him something to hold on to. "You don't get to die on me," I told him on the third night, when his fever spiked and his breathing became shallow. "Not after everything. I didn't drag you out of that snow just to lose you to pneumonia." His eyes opened, glassy, unfocused, and he made a sound so soft I almost missed it. Not pain, something else. Gratitude, maybe, or acknowledgement that I'd stayed, that I wasn't leaving him to face this alone. On the fourth morning, his fever broke. He lived, and when he was strong enough to stand again, he did something he'd never done before. He reached out and touched my face, gentle, deliberate, a gesture so human it made my throat tight. That's when I understood. This wasn't just coexistence anymore. This was family. It started with a cough, just a small thing, barely noticeable, but in the stillness of the cabin it sounded wrong. By evening, he was sitting closer to the stove than usual, and when I touched his shoulder, the heat radiating from his body was unmistakable. Fever. And I had no idea what a normal temperature was for him, no baseline to know if this was serious or just a cold. By the second day, he couldn't eat, could barely drink. I'd hold the cup to his lips and he'd take tiny sips, each one seeming to cost him enormous effort. His breathing developed a rattle that made my chest tight with panic. Pneumonia, maybe, or something worse, something specific to his biology that human medicine couldn't touch. I tried everything. Aspirin crushed in water. He couldn't keep it down. Cold compresses when the fever spiked, warm blankets when he started shaking so violently I thought his bones might break. I boiled willow bark the way my father had taught me, made him drink the bitter tea. Nothing worked. The fever climbed higher, and all I could do was sit beside him and watch him burn. The second night was the worst. His breathing became so shallow I had to lean close to make sure he was still alive. His eyes stayed closed, his massive body slack, and I found myself talking to him like he could hear me. Not about anything important, just stream of consciousness rambling. Stories from my childhood, memories of my father, confessions about my failed marriage, anything to fill the silence, to give him a thread to follow back if he was lost somewhere in the fever. I was a terrible wife, I told him sometime around 3 a.m., my voice hoarse from hours of talking. Tom deserved better. He wanted someone who could be present, who could share herself, and I was always holding something back, always keeping parts of myself locked away. I laughed, bitter and tired. And now here I am, living with a secret so big it dwarfs everything else. And somehow with you, I'm more honest than I ever was with him. Isn't that ridiculous? He didn't respond. Couldn't. But I kept talking anyway. On the third night, his fever spiked so high I could feel the heat from 3 feet away. His breathing became ragged, desperate, like his body was fighting a war it was losing. I knelt beside him, my hand on his chest, feeling his heart race, and I felt something inside me break. "Please," I whispered, "please don't leave me. I know that's selfish. I know you probably want to be with your family, your people, but I'm not ready to lose you. I'm not ready to be alone again." Tears were running down my face, hot and fast. You became my family. You understand that? Somewhere along the way, you stopped being a responsibility and started being the only thing that matters. So you don't get to die. You don't get to give up. His eyes opened then, just slightly, and through the glaze of fever I saw recognition. He heard me. He understood. The fever broke just before dawn on the fourth day. I woke from a fitful doze to find his breathing had changed, still labored but steady, stronger. When I touched his forehead, the fire had receded to a manageable warmth. He was going to live. I sat there on the floor, my back against the wall, and cried. Not pretty crying, ugly gasping sobs of relief and exhaustion and delayed terror. All the fear I'd been holding back for 3 days came flooding out, and I couldn't stop it. It took him another week to regain his strength. I watched him slowly come back, first sitting up, then standing, then moving around the cabin with increasing steadiness. And one morning, when I was sitting by the window drinking coffee, he came and sat beside me, looked at me for a long moment, then reached out and touched my face. His hand was so large it could have crushed my skull, but his touch was gentle, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, brushing away tears I didn't know I'd been crying. And in his amber eyes, I saw something that made my breath catch. The same thing I felt for him. Not gratitude, not dependence, love, not romantic love, that would be absurd, impossible. But the kind of love that comes from choosing someone again and again through crisis and mundanity and fear. The kind of love that says, your life matters more to me than my comfort. Your survival is worth any sacrifice I have to make. I'd spent 6 years convincing myself this was temporary, that eventually he'd leave or I'd find a solution or something would change. But in that moment, with his hand on my face and both of us understanding how close we'd come to losing each other, I stopped lying to myself. This was my life now. He was my family now. And whatever came next, we'd face it together, even if neither of us knew how long together could possibly last. By 2012, we'd been together 8 years, and I'd never stopped wondering about the gaps in his story. The scars I'd seen that first night, they weren't from an animal attack. They were too precise, too deliberate. Sometimes I'd catch him touching them absent-mindedly, his expression distant, and I'd want to ask, who hurt you? Where did you come from? But I had no way to frame those questions, no language we shared that could handle that complexity. So I watched, and I waited, and I collected pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. He was careful about Walt's visits, too careful, like he'd had practice hiding before. He never went outside during the day, only at night, and only when he'd stood at the window for long minutes first, checking. He startled at certain sounds, helicopter engines especially, and would go completely still until they passed. Whatever his life had been before that blizzard, it had taught him to hide, to fear being seen, to expect danger from humans. And I'd become his shelter from that danger. But shelter isn't the same as safety. And I was starting to realize that keeping him hidden might be protecting him, or it might just be keeping him prisoner with better intentions than whoever had given him those scars. The scars ran in straight lines across his chest and upper arms, too straight to be natural, too uniform to be random. I'd memorized them over the years, the way you memorize the features of someone you love. Some were old, silvered, and faded into his fur. Others were newer, raised and angry-looking even years later. And on his right shoulder, there was something that made my stomach turn every time I saw it. A mark that looked disturbingly like a brand, circular and deliberate, though whatever symbol it had once been was now obscured by scar tissue. One evening in March, I was cleaning up after dinner when I heard it, the distant thump of helicopter blades cutting through the cold air. Not unusual. We got military choppers sometimes, or medical evacuations from the region. But the moment the sound registered, he moved. Not just moved, transformed. In seconds, he'd gone from relaxed to completely rigid, pressed against the wall near the window, his breathing rapid and shallow. His eyes were wide, tracking the sound as it grew louder, then passed overhead, then faded. But even after it was gone, even after silence returned, he stayed frozen, waiting, listening, ready to run or hide or fight. "It's okay," I said quietly, keeping my distance because I'd learned not to approach when he was like this. "It's gone. They're not looking for you." But how did I know that? How could I promise him safety when I didn't know who they were, or what they wanted, or whether they were still searching after all these years? It took him 20 minutes to come back to himself. 20 minutes of standing absolutely still, every muscle tensed, before he finally exhaled and moved away from the wall. And when he looked at me, I saw something in his expression that broke my heart. Shame. He was ashamed of his fear, of his trauma, of the way his body betrayed him when certain triggers hit. "Don't," I said. "Don't apologize. Whatever happened to you, whatever they did, you're allowed to be afraid." He made a sound, low and pained, and moved to his drawing supplies. For the next hour, he drew, and I watched the story unfold in crude images that told me more than I wanted to know. The building he'd shown me before, but now with more detail. Cages, tables, figures in white coats, and him, younger, smaller, being held down while something was done to him. Restraints around his wrists and ankles, needles, bright lights, pain represented by jagged lines radiating from his body. "They experimented on you," I whispered, feeling sick. "How long? How long were you there?" He held up fingers, one hand, then the other, then started over. I stopped him at 15. 15 years. He'd been captive for 15 years before he escaped. Before that blizzard, before the injuries that had brought him to my doorstep. And suddenly, his behavior made terrible sense. The way he automatically hid when visitors came, the way he never went outside during daylight, the way he checked and double-checked before moving from one spot to another. These weren't quirks. These were survival mechanisms learned through years of captivity and abuse. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, that humans did that to you." He drew more, showed me others like him in adjacent cages, showed me escape, a door left open or forced open, I couldn't tell, showed me running, being chased, getting injured, and then the storm, the collapse, me finding him, the circle closed. "You didn't just get lost in the blizzard," I said, understanding. "You were escaping. They were chasing you, and you ran until you couldn't run anymore." He tapped the drawing. "Yes." Then he drew something that made my blood run cold. Helicopters, search parties with lights, people with weapons, all radiating out from the building, looking for him, hunting him, and by hiding him here for 8 years, I'd been protecting him from recapture. But I'd also been keeping him in another kind of cage, a comfortable one, a loving one even, but still, a cage. He couldn't leave without risking being found, couldn't live freely, couldn't see daylight without fear, couldn't exist except in the shadows of my cabin. I'd saved him from one prison only to create another. "Do they still look for you?" I asked. "After all this time?" He made a gesture, maybe uncertain. Then he drew the brand on his shoulder, pointed to it, then drew figures scanning crowds or forests with devices. Tracking. They'd marked him somehow, made him traceable. And even if they weren't actively searching anymore, if they ever got close enough, if their equipment ever picked up his signal or his presence, they'd come for him. That night, I lay awake thinking about the impossible math of it all. 8 years I'd kept him hidden, kept him safe. But at what cost? He'd traded 15 years in a cage for 8 years in hiding. Different circumstances, different intentions. But was the outcome really that different? He still couldn't be free. Still couldn't live the life he was meant to live. And I'd convinced myself I was helping him, that keeping him here was the compassionate choice. But maybe I was just the kindest of his captors, and that didn't make me innocent. It just made me more insidious, because he trusted me, loved me even, and that trust kept him here as surely as any lock or chain. I thought about my father, how he'd spent his last months knowing the hospital was just prolonging the inevitable. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go," he'd told me near the end, even when letting go means losing something you love. 2014, early spring. I was 54 years old and I'd started noticing things I couldn't ignore. My knees ached in the cold, my back protested after splitting wood. Small reminders that I was getting older, that this life I'd built, isolated, physically demanding, had an expiration date. And he'd noticed too. Started taking on more of the heavy work without being asked. Would position himself between me and anything that required lifting. Once, when I slipped on ice and went down hard, he was there before I could even register the pain, helping me up with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his size. "I'm fine," I said, embarrassed. But he didn't move away, just kept one massive hand on my arm until I was steady. his expression concerned. That's when it hit me. What happens to him when I'm gone? I had no family to leave the cabin to, no plan for what came next. This arrangement we'd built over 10 years depended entirely on me being here, being capable, and that wouldn't last forever. The thought kept me up at night, a new kind of worry added to all the others. The realization came gradually, then all at once. I'd catch myself moving slower in the mornings, taking longer to warm up. Tasks that used to be routine, hauling water, clearing snow, maintaining the generator, had become genuine labor. And every time I struggled, he was there, lifting what I couldn't lift, reaching what I couldn't reach, moving with the same strength he'd always had while I diminished beside him. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so frightening. There was no single moment of collapse, no injury that suddenly changed everything. Just the slow, inexorable arithmetic of aging, joints that ached more, muscles that recovered slower, a body that was quietly, insistently reminding me that I was mortal. One morning in April, I woke up unable to get out of bed without pain shooting through my lower back. He appeared in the doorway and took in the situation immediately. Without a word, he brought me water, helped me sit up, and then did something that broke me. He drew a question mark in the air. "Are you okay?" "I'm getting old," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm getting old and you're not, and I don't know what that means for us." He sat down beside the bed and looked at me with those amber eyes. Then he reached out and took my hand. Just held it. I understood what he was telling me. I'm here. Whatever comes, I'm here. But that was the problem. He was here because of me. When I was gone, when my body finally gave out, what then? I found him reading one of my desperate lists one evening. When he looked up, his expression was resigned, like he'd been thinking the same thoughts. He drew two figures, one large, one small. Then, the small figure fading, becoming translucent. Then, the large figure alone, surrounded by darkness. That's what he feared most. Not my death specifically, but the return to isolation. "You could leave," I said, "before I get too old. You don't have to stay here waiting for me to die." He made a sound, sharp, almost angry, and drew with more force. The two figures again, connected by a line. Then he tapped his chest, tapped mine, brought both hands together. "We're bound. We stay together." He drew again. The two figures, one supporting the other. Then the positions reversed, taking turns, sharing the burden. That's what family did. "You deserve better than this," I whispered. "Better than a life that depends entirely on one fragile person staying alive." But he reached out and touched my face, and I saw in his eyes what he'd been trying to tell me. This wasn't about deserving. This was about choice. He'd chosen me 10 years ago. He was choosing me now, even knowing what it cost. That night, I stopped making lists of what he'd do without me. Instead, I started planning how to make the time we had left count. Because he'd taught me something. Love isn't about keeping someone forever. It's about making the time you have matter even when you know it has to end. Summer 2016, something changed. He started spending more time at the window, staring out at the mountains with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. He'd pace, not agitated exactly, but purposeful, like he was working through a decision. And at night, sometimes he'd go outside and just stand there in the darkness, facing north, so still he could have been a statue. I'd watch from the window, not intruding, and wonder, is he hearing something I can't, sensing something? Or is he just, finally after 12 years, feeling the pull to leave? Part of me wanted to ask him to stay, the selfish part that had gotten used to not being alone, that had built a life around our strange companionship. But another part, the part that remembered he'd had a life before that blizzard, probably had a family, a community, a place he belonged, knew I couldn't ask that. It started in June. I woke one morning to find him already awake, standing at the window with his hand pressed against the glass, not looking at anything specific, just staring north with an expression I couldn't read. When I asked if he was okay, he didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. The first few times I thought maybe he was just restless from being inside too much. We'd had a long winter, a wet spring. Maybe he just needed more time outside. But he wasn't exploring or exercising. He was always facing the same direction, always north. "What do you hear?" I asked one night. "Is someone calling you?" He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight I saw something in his expression that made my chest tight. Longing, deep, aching longing for something I couldn't give him. When he came back inside, I pushed paper and pencil toward him. "Show me." He drew for a long time. The mountains to the north. Then figures like himself, small in the distance. And between him and those figures, he drew a barrier. Then himself on one side, alone, and the others on the far side, together. "Your family," I said, understanding. "You can sense them and you can't reach them." He drew something that made my stomach drop. A clock, hands moving, time running out, then helicopters, search parties, weapons, all converging on those distant figures, and himself, trapped here, unable to warn them. "The ones who were hunting you," I said slowly. "Are they getting close? To your family?" He drew the brand on his shoulder. Trackers. If he left, if he went to them, he'd lead the hunters straight to whatever remained of his kind. "So you're trapped." I understood the full horror. "You can sense them, you know they're in danger, but you can't go to them without making it worse." He made that broken sound I'd heard only a few times, pure anguish. And I watched him break down in a way I'd never seen, his whole body shaking, sounds of grief so raw they made my throat close. Over the next weeks, the restlessness got worse. He'd stand at the window for entire days. He stopped eating regularly. He'd draw the same pictures over and over, his family, the hunters, the distance between them. And I watched, helpless, as the being I'd sheltered for 12 years was torn apart by something I couldn't fix. One evening in late July, I found him packing. Not obviously, just gathering small things. A blanket, some dried food, a knife I'd given him years ago for carving. He was preparing to leave, even knowing what it would cost, even knowing he might lead the hunters straight to his family, because staying here, safe and hidden while they died, was worse than any risk to himself. "When?" I asked, my voice shaking. He held up fingers. "Days, maybe. A week, at most." I should have argued, but I couldn't, because I'd seen the agony in his expression, the weight of choosing his own safety over his family's survival. And I understood what I'd been asking him to accept by keeping him here. That night, I understood our time together was ending. Not because he didn't care about me, but because love sometimes means letting someone go toward danger, if that's what their heart demands. March 2018. It was our last night together, though I didn't know it yet. There was still snow on the ground, but spring was coming. I could smell it in the air. He'd been agitated all day, pacing, checking the windows. But after dinner, he sat me down at the table and drew something I wasn't expecting. A map, not of Alaska, of the whole continent. And on it, marked with careful X's, locations, dozens of them. Across Canada, the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, even into the Southeast. "What is this?" I asked. He drew more. Figures that looked like him. Then humans with weapons. Then the same figures, lying down, crossed out, dead. He was showing me a pattern, a purge. "Someone's hunting you. Hunting all of you." He nodded, then drew something else that made my blood run cold. A timeline. Past, present, future. In the past section, many figures like him. In the present, fewer. In the future, he paused before drawing this, none. They're being systematically eliminated. Every population, every region, and whatever force was behind it had resources, organization, reach. This wasn't just hunting. This was extinction. Planned, deliberate. My hands were shaking as I studied the map. Each X represented a location where his kind had been eliminated. I counted them. 37. 37 populations wiped out. And the dates he'd marked beside them showed acceleration. 1 or 2 eliminations per year in the 1990s, 5 or 6 per year in the 2000s. By 2015, they were eliminating multiple populations per month. "How do you know this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know what's happening hundreds of miles away?" He drew something that made my stomach turn. Figures like him connected by wavy lines, communication across distance. They could sense each other somehow, feel when one of their kind died, know when a population was under attack. And for the past decade, he'd been feeling them disappear, one by one, group by group, a whole species dying while he hid in my cabin, safe and helpless and guilty. "Oh God," I whispered, "you've known this whole time. Every year you've stayed with me, you've been feeling them die." He touched his chest, that gesture that meant pain, acknowledgement, truth. Then he drew more frantically, filling page after page. The facilities where they were taken, the experiments conducted, the bodies disposed of, and the organization behind it. He drew a symbol, something official-looking, governmental. This wasn't rogue hunters or cryptozoologists. This was institutional. This was policy. Why? What threat do you pose? He drew humans, resources, territory. We wanted what they had: land, wilderness, areas they'd lived in for thousands of years, and their existence was inconvenient to that expansion. So the decision had been made, probably decades ago, to remove the inconvenience, to classify them as animals, deny them personhood, and eliminate them with the same efficiency we'd eliminated wolves and bears and anything else that got in the way of human progress. But you're intelligent. You're people. They can't just... He drew a simple image that silenced me. A courtroom, a gavel, papers being signed. They could. They had. Someone, somewhere, had made it legal, had classified his kind as non-human, non-protected, acceptable losses in the name of national security or resource management or whatever justification let people sleep at night while committing genocide. I pushed back from the table, needing space, needing air. 13 years I'd been hiding him, keeping him safe, thinking I was protecting one individual from recapture. But I'd been hiding evidence. A survivor. A witness to systematic extermination. And by staying silent, by keeping him secret, I'd been complicit in that extermination. Because nobody knew. The world had no idea this was happening. I should have said something. Years ago. Gone to the media, the authorities. Even if it meant losing you, at least people would know. But he was shaking his head, drawing quickly. He showed me what happened to people who tried to expose it. Witnesses who disappeared, journalists who died in accidents, activists whose credibility was destroyed. So we do nothing? We just accept that your entire species is being erased. He drew one more thing. His family, the figures he'd drawn so many times, his children. And beneath them, he wrote a date. 3 weeks. That's how long they had. The hunters were closing in on the last remaining group, and in 3 weeks, they'd be gone. That's why he was leaving. 3 weeks to cover hundreds of miles, evade hunters, find his family, and somehow protect them. It was impossible, but he was going anyway. "I'll come with you." But he was already shaking his head, drawing me, old and slow, unable to keep up. I'd be a liability. Taking me would just get us both killed faster. "Then what do I do? You're going to walk out of here tomorrow, and I'm never going to see you again, and I'm just supposed to live with that?" He drew his final image. Me, holding the maps and drawings, keeping the evidence, bearing witness. If he died, when he died, someone needed to remember. He wasn't done. With shaking hands, and yes, they were shaking, I could see fear in every line of his massive frame. He drew another picture, a facility, buildings, fences, and inside, small figures, children. "Oh God," I whispered. He pointed to himself, then to the children, then made a gesture we'd developed over the years. Family. He had children. Somewhere in one of those facilities, he had children who'd been taken, and he was leaving to find them, even knowing it probably meant his death. That's when everything made sense. The scars weren't from an attack. They were from captivity, from experiments, from whatever had been done to him before he'd escaped. The fear of helicopters and humans wasn't paranoia. It was memory. And the reason he'd stayed with me for 12 years, hiding, healing, waiting, he'd been gathering strength for what came next. "You can't go. They'll kill you." He picked up the pencil one more time and wrote, slowly, laboriously, letters he'd learned by watching me. 2 words. They die. His children. If he didn't try to save them, they'd die in captivity. And he was telling me this not for help, what could I do, but because someone needed to know. Someone needed to bear witness to what was happening, to what was being done to his kind, to know that when he disappeared, it was a choice, that he'd walked into death willingly, for love. How many? He held up 2 fingers. 2 children who'd spent their entire lives in captivity, while their father had been here with me, safe and warm, learning to do puzzles and drink berry tea. How old were they when you were separated? He drew small figures, maybe waist-high, young, babies, and now they'd grown up in a cage, and their father had been alive the whole time, unable to help them. Is that where you got these scars? They marked you there? He nodded, then drew more. Him in a cage, his children in an adjacent cage, both being taken out separately for procedures, the children crying and him unable to reach them. How did you escape? He drew a door left open, an accident, him taking the chance, running, but only able to save himself, not having time to free his children, having to choose, die trying and accomplish nothing, or run alone and maybe someday come back. He'd chosen to run, and he'd been living with that choice every day since. You were going to go back. All this time, you were preparing. He showed me a calendar, counting. He'd been waiting for them to move the children. Facilities relocated every few years, security changed, and the next relocation was happening now. In 3 weeks. His only chance. But they're still hunting you. The tracking. You'll lead them right to your children. He wrote again. Better together. Better to die together than live separated. Better to try and fail than never try. What do you need from me? He drew. Me, holding all his drawings, keeping them safe. And if he didn't return, he drew a clock pointing to 6 months from now. I should assume he'd died. Then I should decide what to do with the evidence. I don't want this responsibility. I don't want to be the one who decides whether your story gets told. But he touched my hand, and I saw in his eyes what he needed me to understand. This was the only gift he could give me. The burden of witnessing, but also the power to determine what that witnessing meant. I'll remember. If you don't come back, when you don't come back, I'll remember everything, who you were, what you faced, what you chose. He pulled me close then, the first real embrace we'd ever shared, his massive arms around me, both of us holding onto each other like we could stop time. I could feel his heartbeat, strong, steady, terrified. I love you, I said into his chest. You're my family. You'll always be my family. He made a sound, soft, broken, full of everything words couldn't express. And I understood he loved me too. Not romantic, but deeper maybe. The love of 2 beings who'd chosen each other across impossible circumstances. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were wet, and I knew this was goodbye. Go save your children, and if you can't save them, then be with them at the end. That's what a parent does. He touched my face one last time. Then he gathered his few possessions and prepared to walk out of my life forever. I didn't stop him, because I'd finally learned what love really meant. Letting someone go toward the thing that mattered most, even when it destroyed you. That's what he'd taught me over 13 years. That love wasn't about keeping someone safe in your orbit. It was about witnessing who they really were, and stepping aside when the time came for them to choose themselves. He left the next morning before dawn. Just there one moment and gone the next, disappeared into the mountains heading north. He took nothing but modified clothes and a backpack of supplies, and he left me with a map, a timeline, and knowledge I didn't know what to do with. That was 6 years ago. I've heard nothing since. Don't know if he found his children, if he survived, if he's still out there somewhere, or if he became another X on that map he drew. But I think about him every day, about the choice he made, knowing it was probably suicide, but making it anyway, because love demanded it. About the secret I've kept for 19 years total now, and what it means that I've stayed silent. The first year after he left was the hardest. I'd wake up expecting to see him by the wood stove, would make 2 cups of tea before remembering. The cabin felt too big and too small at the same time, empty of his presence, but full of his absence. I kept his drawings in a box under my bed, pulling them out some nights when the silence became unbearable, tracing the lines he'd made with those massive, careful fingers. I waited the 6 months he'd asked me to wait. Marked each day on a calendar, hoping irrationally that he'd come back, that somehow he'd managed the impossible. When the 6 months passed with no sign, no word, I spent 3 days crying. Then I put the calendar away and tried to figure out how to live with not knowing. Walt noticed something was different on his next visit. "You seem sadder. You sure you're doing okay out here alone?" "I'm fine," I lied, and the ease with which the lie came out made me realize how practiced I'd become at deception. 19 years of hiding the most important relationship of my life had turned me into someone who could smile and lie while carrying impossible knowledge. I've thought about going public 1,000 times, but every time I get close, I think about what he showed me: witnesses who disappeared, journalists who died. And I think about the others who might still be alive somewhere. Would exposing the truth save them or help the hunters find them faster? So I've stayed silent, and I've had to live with what that silence means. Some days I convince myself I'm being prudent, protecting his memory by keeping their existence secret. Other days I know I'm just a coward, choosing my own safety over justice. The cabin is different now. I'm 63 years old, moving slower, feeling the weight of isolation. I've thought about leaving, but I can't. Because what if he comes back? What if, against all odds, he survived? If I'm not here, where would he go? So I stay. I keep the drawings safe. That's the one thing I'm certain about. The maps, the timelines, the evidence of systematic elimination. When I die, someone will find them. Someone will know this happened. That beings like him existed, loved, suffered, and were erased. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of me now, old, alone, still keeping his secret. Would he be grateful or disappointed I didn't do more? I'd like to think he'd understand, that after 14 years together, he'd know I'm doing the best I can. What I do know is this: for 14 years, I shared my life with someone extraordinary, someone who taught me what real love looks like, not the romantic kind from movies, but the kind that shows up every day, that sits with grief, that makes impossible choices in lives with the consequences. I was 44 when I found him dying in the snow. I'm 63 now. Half my adult life has been defined by his presence or his absence, and I wouldn't change it. Even knowing how it ended, even carrying this weight, I wouldn't change a single moment, because he mattered. His life mattered. His children matter. And even if the world never knows, even if their species is erased without anyone noticing, I will remember. I will carry their story until I die. That's all I can offer now. This testimony, this confession, this evidence that somewhere in the vast machinery of human progress, beings of profound intelligence and capacity for love were systematically eliminated. And one woman loved one of them, sheltered him, let him go, and has spent 6 years wondering if that was enough. I don't know if it was enough. I'll never know. But it's all I had to give.